Thank you very much. And again, like everyone else who's spoken so far, I want to congratulate the RMT for organising this meeting and for taking this issue not only to the top of the unions but also right down into the branches around the London Transport region. And I think it's an incredibly important meeting that we're having tonight. As Mac mentioned, I want to talk mainly about the Egyptian revolution and why I think that the Egyptian revolution is so important for the question of Palestinian liberation and why Palestinian liberation is also central to the fate of the Egyptian revolution. For a start, the question of Palestine is not and has not been, ever since the Nakba itself and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which El Pape described, been an external issue for the Egyptian people or for the Egyptian working class. That it runs throughout the whole experience of struggle from below in Egypt in very direct and concrete ways. And I want to read out to you a statement that was adopted by a number of unions affiliated to the new Independent Union Federation that's developed in Egypt since the revolution. This Federation of Independent Unions was founded in Tahrir Square in the middle of the uprising against Mubarak with just four unions, including the Tax Collectors Union, which was the first independent union to be founded for over 50 years in Egypt, back before the revolution. In June, 15 unions signed up to this statement, which is part of a longer statement affirming principles of trade union independence from external funding, and also actually, very importantly, the control of the rank and file of the trade unions over the officials and the bureaucracy. It includes an entire paragraph on the question of Palestine. And they said, the independent unions completely reject any form of normal relations with the Zionist enemy, as they reject all forms of cooperation with any person or organisation who is involved in normalisation or is calling for normalisation. We affirm our complete support for the right of the Arab Palestinian people to create an independent state in the whole of Palestine and their right to use whatever means of resistance to achieve their rights. We affirm also that one of the principal reasons for our rejection of the old Egyptian Trade Union Federation is its subservience to the state and the National Democratic Party, the former ruling party in Egypt, and its participation in a visit to occupied Jerusalem, its failure to take any position opposing the policy of normalisation, such as the Qualified Industrial Zones Agreement, the gas supply agreement, and other policies which the Egyptian Trade Union Federation by its silence supported, while the Egyptian workers' movement rejected them and was resisting them. And when you take that statement and you realise that it was signed up to by around 15 unions in June this year, representing a huge spread of the newly emerging independent union movement, including the Transport Workers Union in Cairo, including the Pilots Union. The Pilots Union representative apparently sat next to the representative from the Peasants Union in the meeting, the Antiquities Workers Union, the Sales Tax Workers Union, Hospital Workers Unions, and so on. You get a sense of why this is such an important issue for such a wide swathe of the Egyptian working class. And since that meeting took place, this policy has been adopted formally by dozens more unions. Most of the, now there are around 100 unions have signed up to the Independent Union Federation, and this policy and the other principles that I mentioned have been adopted as a kind of policy framework for the Federation itself. And all the reasons that this is so important to the Egyptian working class are mentioned really in the, contained really in short form in some of that statement. That, for example, the qualified industrial zones, which are these kind of, exactly the same kind of arrangement that Adam was mentioning, are being pushed in the West Bank and Gaza. They're kind of export zones in which Egyptian workers are producing goods for export, using part materials and so on that have been part produced in Israel, have a kind of piggyback on the back of an American agreement to get into the American market and to cement the relationship between Israel, Egypt, and America. The Egyptian workers who work in those zones are paid very little, very low wages. They face even more problems in terms of asserting their rights and organising than the workers in the rest of Egypt. There's a question of the natural gas as well that flows from Egypt to Israel. There's the question of the whole occupation of the Sinai, which during, of course, the period of between 1967 and the peace deal that Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt in the 1970s, did, was under direct Israeli occupation. And if you actually want to know why, for example, the city of SOAS played such a fundamental role in the Egyptian revolution this year, many people will tell you it's because SOAS was hardened by the experience of being on the front line of bombardment from the Israeli forces throughout that period, throughout particularly the kind of period of the 1970s, when SOAS was being bombarded on a daily basis by the Israeli army. And then, when you look at what's happened since the revolution, you can really see, again, how this process of weaving the fate of the Palestinians in with the fate of the Egyptian revolution has deepened. Take the question of protests outside the Israeli embassy. Hugh mentioned at the beginning about the protest that took place on the 9th of September outside the Israeli embassy, which stormed the embassy. This is not the first protest, the large protest there's been there this year. And each time has seen a ratcheting up of internal and domestic repression. For example, the 15th of May, in commemoration of Nakba Day, hundreds of Egyptians went to protest at the Israeli embassy. They were met with absolutely brutal repression by the Egyptian state. This was the first time, I think, that the old hated central security forces, the riot police, were redeployed onto the streets of Egypt. Was on that protest. Hundreds of people arrested and tortured. People went back and protested in August after the Israelis had killed Egyptian soldiers within Egypt around in an incident around Gaza. There had been no response.
There was no connection with Gaza at all. I mean, except for the Israeli bombardment. They didn't come from Gaza.
My point was that it was in that area. Yeah. Sorry, not geographically speaking, not connected with Gaza. The generals did nothing in response to this, and therefore it was on the 9th of September. It was thousands of Egyptians who went from Tahrir Square and protested at the Israeli embassy. And in fact, they were the ones who expelled the Israeli ambassador. This, however, brings me on to the central reason, though, that the question of Palestine is so central to the Egyptian revolution, and why Palestinian liberation is such a crucial issue for Egyptian revolutionaries today, which is because if you look at the whole question of who is sustaining the occupation of Palestine, it's not only the question of the Israeli state, and never has been. It is also about the relationship between the Israeli state and the US. And it is also, since the 1970s, has depended absolutely crucially on the central involvement of the Egyptian state in that process. So it is not only that the generals in Egypt are complicit in the oppression of the Palestinians, but they form part of the architecture of imperialism, which has sustained the occupation since Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem in the 1970s. If you think of it as a kind of three-cornered relationship, with Israel on one side, the US on another side, and the Egyptian state on the third side. In fact, as Noam Chomsky put it, a fateful triangle of integrated architecture in order to sustain the occupation of Palestine. But crucially, those same generals, that same regime, which is still in power despite the revolution taking place, despite the fact that Mubarak has been overthrown by his own people, the generals that Mubarak put in place are still there and still hold the reins of power in the state. They are also being shaken from below by the Egyptian working class in particular, by mass mobilisations in the streets in Tahrir Square, yes, but also actually crucially recently by massive strikes on a scale that's not been seen in Egypt for more than 60 years and seen very rarely elsewhere in the region. 750,000 or so workers took part in strikes and protests during September alone, including a strike of around 500,000 teachers, which was raising the demands for massive pay rises, yes, for huge increases in public spending on education, and crucially demanding the fall of the education minister. In fact, the teachers' slogan on their demonstration was, The teachers demand the downfall of the minister, an echo of the people demand the downfall of the regime, which people shouted back in January and February. And this is incredibly important to the whole question of how the Arab revolutions could develop over the coming months and years. And it brings it very directly to the question of where is the force that can start to break down that kind of architecture of imperialism. I'd argue that the Egyptian working class, the Egyptian workers' movement, is the force, is the power that if it's organised, which can break down the core of the old regime, that's still intact. And that if this happens, it will open up a very different world for the Palestinians. And finally, I would say that for us, we're not passive observers into this moment. Our solidarity really matters. In the case of the Egyptian workers' movement, the generals are still in power and they are lashing out. They lashed out against marchers demanding an end to the oppression of Coptic Christians on the 9th of October and killed over 20 people in a brutal attack on a peaceful protest. They're lashing out against workers, for example textile workers, who were cleared out from their protest camp outside the Egyptian parliament a few days ago by the bayonets of the army. They're dragging people before the courts. There are 12,000 activists and ordinary people in jail in Egypt at the moment after a military trial, often for doing no more than going on a demonstration. So the question of solidarity is very concrete, very real and very important. But I would say that the question is also, for the reasons I've tried to explain, an act of direct solidarity with the Palestinians. It should run alongside, not in competition with, but alongside the solidarity we mobilise directly with the Palestinians. And finally, though, we also have to look beyond solidarity. We have to understand that not only does our solidarity matter, but our struggle matters. And what we do to shake our own governments, particularly when it comes to the mass strikes that we hope to see at the end of November, that will also be, if we manage to bring down Cameron, we manage to end his government too, will also be a victory for the Palestinians and for the Egyptians as well.